We've all felt invisible, forgotten by a world that seems to have no place for us. Sometimes it takes just one person willing to see our worth to remind us that we matter. In the mining town of Grizzly Hollow, Bethany Crenshaw came down from her mountain cabin to trade for supplies. The local men forced her to eat scraps off the saloon floor while they laughed. Then Tobias Aldrich walked through those doors. The giant cowboy saw what was happening and did something no one expected. He knelt down beside her on that dirty floor. The whole saloon went quiet. What happened next changed everything for both of them and showed an entire town what real strength looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine-covered slopes like a shroud as Bethany Crenshaw made her way down the narrow mountain trail. Her worn leather trading pouch, cracked and weathered from countless journeys, bounced against her hip with each careful step. Inside lay the fruits of her solitary labor: strips of perfectly smoked venison, bundles of wild herbs, and small carved trinkets that had taken her weeks to complete by lamplight in her cabin. This pouch represented everything she was: self-reliant, resourceful, and utterly alone. At 53, Bethany had lived more years on this mountain than most folks in Grizzly Hollow had drawn breath. Her hands bore the testimony of that life: scarred from skinning game, calloused from chopping wood, steady from years of making do with nothing but her own wits and the mountain's grudging generosity. Her grey-streaked hair, always pulled back in a practical bun, had seen more storms than the town's weather vane. Yet there was a dignity in her bearing that no amount of hardship could erode, a quiet pride that came from never having to ask anyone for anything she couldn't provide herself. The trail wound through ancient pines and weathered granite outcroppings, each turn familiar as the lines on her palm. She'd walked this path 6 times a year for more than 2 decades, always on the same mission: to trade her mountain goods for the few necessities she couldn't make or forage. Salt, ammunition, lamp oil, and the occasional bolt of cloth comprised her entire connection to the world below. As the trail descended, the sounds of civilization grew louder. The rhythmic pounding of the stamp mills echoed through the valley like an irregular heartbeat. Grizzly Hollow had grown around those mills, a town born of desperation and sustained by the slim hope that the next shaft might yield the fortune that had eluded all the others. It was a hard place filled with hard people, and Bethany had learned long ago that her kind weren't particularly welcome. The town spread before her like a collection of weathered wooden boxes scattered in the valley's palm. Main Street ran straight as a rifle shot from the train depot to the cemetery, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more substantial than they were. The Copper Crown Saloon dominated the center of town, its bat-wing doors never quite still, men flowing in and out like ants around a disturbed hill. Bethany paused at the edge of town, as she always did, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The stares would come first, suspicious glances from behind curtains, whispered comments from porch gatherings. Then would come the comments, loud enough for her to hear but not quite direct confrontation. "Mountain woman's back," they'd say. "Wonder what she's got to trade this time." Always said like she was selling something unsavory rather than the finest smoked meat this side of the Continental Divide. She understood their suspicion, even if she didn't appreciate it. To them, she represented something they'd all given up: complete self-sufficiency. While they depended on the company store, the railroad, and each other for survival, she depended on no one. That independence made them uncomfortable, as if her very existence challenged the choices they'd made. The general store stood at the corner of Main and Prospector, its windows dusty from the constant wind that swept down from the peaks. Heinrich Müller had run it for 15 years, a fair man who judged her goods by their quality rather than their source. His wife Emma, however, had never warmed to Bethany's presence. She'd watch from behind the counter with disapproving eyes, as if mountain living was somehow contagious. Bethany pushed open the store's door, the bell announcing her arrival with its familiar chime. Heinrich looked up from his ledger, his round face creasing into a genuine smile. "Miss Crenshaw?" "Right on schedule, as always. What treasures have you brought us today?" She set her pouch on the counter with the careful precision of long habit. "Venison, like always. Some pine needle tea, good for the scurvy that's been going around. And these," she withdrew 3 small wooden figures, each carved with meticulous detail. A mountain goat balanced on a rocky ledge, a pine tree with individually detailed needles, and a bear standing upright as if surveying his domain. Heinrich picked up the bear, turning it in his hands with admiration. "Your work gets finer every time, Miss Crenshaw. Mrs. Patterson's been asking about one of your carvings for her mantelpiece." "She can afford it," Bethany replied simply. It wasn't arrogance, just fact. Mrs. Patterson owned the boarding house and charged premium rates for clean sheets and decent meals. Emma Mueller emerged from the back room, her expression cooling the moment she spotted Bethany. "Heinrich, don't forget we need to save space for the Johnson shipment coming in on tomorrow's train." The message was clear. Don't encourage the mountain woman to linger. Heinrich caught his wife's tone and sighed almost imperceptibly. After 15 years of marriage, he recognized the warning signs. "Of course, Emma. Miss Crenshaw, shall we conduct our usual business?" They went through the familiar ritual of negotiation. Bethany's goods were always fairly priced because she understood their true value, and Heinrich respected that knowledge. Within minutes, they'd settled on terms: the venison and herbs for salt, lamp oil and coffee, the carvings for a small bolt of wool cloth and some sugar. "I'll need to visit Jameson's for ammunition," Bethany said, wrapping her new supplies in the empty pouch. Heinrich nodded. "He's got some of those 4440 cartridges you prefer. Came in last week." As Bethany prepared to leave, the store's door chimed again. 3 men entered, their conversation dying the moment they spotted her. She recognized them all. Pete Hawkins, who worked the Lucky Strike claim, Dutch Vanderberg, a shift supervisor at the stamp mill, and Tommy Brennan, barely 21, and trying too hard to prove he belonged with older, harder men. "Well, well," Pete said, his voice carrying that tone Bethany had heard too many times before. "Mountain woman's come down to visit civilization." She didn't respond, simply gathered her supplies and moved toward the door. But Dutch stepped sideways, not quite blocking her path, but making it clear she'd have to ask permission to pass. "Heard you had quite the winter up there," he said. "Must get lonely, talking to nothing but trees and rocks." "I manage," Bethany replied, her voice steady. Young Tommy, emboldened by his companions, added, "Maybe you should consider moving to town. Get yourself cleaned up. Find a man to take care of you proper." Heinrich cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Gentlemen, if you need supplies, I'm happy to help. Otherwise..." "Otherwise what, Miller?" Pete's voice carried an edge. "We can't have a friendly conversation with our neighbor." Bethany had heard enough. She moved toward the door, and this time Dutch let her pass, but not without a parting comment. "You're always welcome at the Copper Crown, Miss Crenshaw. We'll make sure you feel right at home." The laughter that followed her out the door was ugly, full of implications she understood all too well. The ammunition store proved blessedly free of complications. Old man Jameson was a veteran of too many wars to waste time on social niceties. He sold her what she needed and wished her safe travels, the way one professional acknowledges another. But as Bethany made her final stop, a brief visit to the post office to check for any correspondence that never came, she became aware of being watched. Not the usual curious glances, but something more focused, more predatory. The Copper Crown saloon had spilled its afternoon clientele onto the street. A dozen men lounged against the hitching posts and porch railings, nursing bottles and watching the town's activity with the lazy attention of men who had nowhere else to be. Their conversation quieted as she passed, then resumed in tones just loud enough for her to catch fragments. "Living up there like some kind of animal. Probably hasn't seen a mirror in years. Ought to teach her some manners." Bethany kept walking, her spine straight and her pace steady. She'd endured worse over the years, and words couldn't hurt her the way winter storms or hungry bears could. But something felt different today. The attention seemed more concentrated, more purposeful than usual. She completed her business and prepared to leave town. But as she passed the saloon one final time, Pete Hawkins called out from the porch, "Miss Crenshaw, you're leaving so soon. Why don't you come in for a drink on the house?" The offer was accompanied by snickers from his companions. Bethany didn't break stride. "Come on," Dutch added. "We're just being neighborly. Don't you believe in being neighborly?" The word neighborly carried a weight of sarcasm that made several men laugh outright. But Bethany had reached her horse, tied at the far end of the street, and was already loading her supplies into the saddlebags. What she didn't see, as she prepared to leave, was the figure watching from the shadows of the livery stable, Tobias. Aldrich had arrived in Grizzly Hollow just as she had, but by train rather than mountain trail. He stood 6'7" in his worn boots, a man whose quiet presence seemed to fill more space than his considerable frame should require. His silver pocket watch, inherited from his father, ticked steadily in his vest pocket, a reminder of the values that had shaped him and the reason he'd never been able to walk away from trouble when he encountered it. Tobias had seen enough towns like Grizzly Hollow to recognize the signs. The way certain men gathered and fed off each other's worst instincts, the way they found entertainment in others' discomfort, the way they convinced themselves that cruelty was just good fun. He'd also seen enough of life to recognize dignity when he encountered it, and the mountain woman loading her supplies with quiet efficiency clearly possessed more of that quality than all the men on the saloon porch combined. As Bethany mounted her horse and began her journey home, Tobias made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of continuing on to the next town as he'd planned, he would stay in Grizzly Hollow for a while. Something told him that his particular skills, reading people, understanding trouble, and knowing when to step between the strong and the vulnerable, might be needed here. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been building in this town for years, waiting only for the right moment and the right catalyst to finally explode into the open. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into every corner of Grizzly Hollow. Bethany had planned to be halfway back up the mountain by now, but her horse had thrown a shoe just as she'd prepared to leave the boarding house where she'd spent the night. Mrs. Patterson had been civil enough, though her hospitality came with a premium price and the unspoken understanding that such arrangements were temporary. Now, waiting for the blacksmith to complete his work, Bethany found herself with time to kill in a town that had made its feelings about her presence abundantly clear. She sat on the boarding house porch, watching the morning activities with the patient attention of someone accustomed to waiting for weather to change or game to appear. The Copper Crown Saloon opened early in mining towns, catering to night shift workers ending their day, and day shift workers needing liquid courage to begin theirs. By 10 in the morning, it was already alive, with the sounds of men seeking entertainment in the bottom of bottles. Pete Hawkins emerged from the saloon, his gait unsteady despite the early hour. He spotted Bethany on the porch, and his face lit up with the kind of inspiration that usually preceded poor decisions. "Boys," he called back into the saloon. "Mountain woman still here, still all dressed up in her fancy town clothes?" The sarcasm in his voice drew laughter from inside. Bethany wore the same practical wool dress she always wore to town, clean but clearly mended in several places, appropriate for someone who valued function over fashion. More men emerged from the saloon, drawn by the promise of entertainment. Dutch van der Berg, Tommy Brennan, and half a dozen others Bethany recognized, but didn't know by name. They formed a loose semicircle in front of the saloon, their attention focused on her like wolves studying potential prey. "Miss Crenshaw," Dutch called out in a mockingly formal tone. "We've been discussing your situation, and we've come to a conclusion." Bethany didn't respond, but she felt her muscles tense the way they did when she sensed a predator nearby. "We think you've been living up on that mountain so long. You've forgotten how civilized people behave," Pete added. "Forgotten your manners, so to speak." Tommy, emboldened by the group's energy, stepped closer. "We figured it was our Christian duty to remind you. Teach you some proper social graces. Come on over here, mountain woman," Dutch said, his voice carrying a command rather than an invitation. "Time for a little education." Bethany stood slowly, her hand instinctively checking for the small knife she always carried. The boarding house porch was elevated, giving her a slight advantage. But she was one woman against a dozen increasingly aggressive men. "I have business to attend to," she said calmly. "Your business can wait," Pete replied. "This is more important. Community improvement, you might say." The circle of men began to tighten, moving with the casual coordination of a pack that had done this before. Not with her, perhaps, but with others who had fallen outside their narrow definition of acceptable. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the boarding house doorway, took one look at the situation, and quickly retreated inside, the latch clicking decisively behind her. Across the street, other townspeople had noticed the gathering, but found sudden interest in their own affairs. "Now, Miss Crenshaw," Dutch said, his tone becoming paternal in a way that made Bethany's skin crawl. "The first thing a lady needs to learn is her proper place. And around here, that place is wherever we tell her it is." He gestured toward the saloon entrance. "Come inside. We'll show you how a real woman behaves." "I'm not going in there," Bethany said, her voice steady, despite the fear growing in her chest. The men laughed, and the sound had nothing warm or human in it. "Oh, but you are," Pete said. "See, that's lesson number 1. When decent folks give you an invitation, you accept it graciously." 2 men moved to flank the porch steps, while others closed in from the sides. Bethany realized that her options were rapidly disappearing. She could try to run, but where? She could fight, but against 12 men? She could scream, but who would come to help a mountain woman against half the town's working population? "What's it going to be, mountain woman?" Tommy asked. "You going to come quietly, or do we need to carry you?" The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Bethany looked from face to face, searching for some trace of decency, some spark of humanity that might make them reconsider. She found only the blank stares of men who had convinced themselves that cruelty was entertainment and that her dignity was their plaything. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come." The men cheered as if they'd won some great victory. They formed an escort around her as she descended the porch steps, making sure she couldn't change her mind or bolt for freedom. Inside the Copper Crown, the morning light struggled to penetrate windows stained brown with tobacco smoke and neglect. The air was thick with the smell of spilled beer, unwashed bodies, and something else, something predatory that made Bethany's stomach clench. "Now then," Dutch said, positioning himself near the bar like a teacher preparing to address a class. "First lesson in proper behavior. A lady always waits to be served." He gestured to the floor near the bar's base, where the sawdust was darkest with accumulated spills and tobacco juice. "Have a seat, Miss Crenshaw. Make yourself comfortable." Bethany remained standing. "I'd prefer to stand, thank you." The politeness of her response drew more laughter. "Oh, but that's not how this works," Pete said. "You see, up on your mountain you might be queen of the hill, but down here you follow our rules." He moved closer, and Bethany caught the smell of whiskey on his breath mixed with something more menacing. "Now sit down, on the floor, like a good little mountain woman." When she didn't immediately comply, Tommy and another man stepped forward, their intent clear. Bethany realized she was trapped with nowhere to run and no one to call for help. The weight of her isolation, which had always been her strength, suddenly became her greatest vulnerability. She lowered herself to the filthy floor, her knees touching the sawdust and spilled liquor. The humiliation burned in her throat like bile, but she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward. "That's better," Dutch said approvingly. "Now lesson number 2. A lady always waits patiently for her meal." He reached behind the bar and produced a wooden bowl, cracked and stained, the kind used to feed dogs behind the saloon. He filled it with scraps from the bar, stale bread crusts, bits of jerky that had fallen to the floor, dregs from the bottom of beer glasses. "Here you go," he said, setting the bowl in front of her. "A meal fit for a mountain woman." The men crowded closer, forming a circle around her crouched form. Their faces showed a mixture of excitement and disgust, as if they were both thrilled and repulsed by their own actions. "Go on," Pete urged. "Eat up. Show us those mountain manners." Bethany stared at the bowl, her mind reeling. 20 years of self-reliance, of surviving blizzards and bears, and the crushing loneliness of mountain life had not prepared her for this particular form of degradation. "I said eat," Dutch commanded, his voice losing its false joviality and revealing the cruelty beneath. The circle of men pressed closer, their presence oppressive as smoke. Bethany understood with crystalline clarity that they would not let her leave until she complied, that this humiliation was the price of her freedom, and that refusing would only lead to something worse, with dignity she didn't know she still possessed. She lowered her head toward the bowl. That was when the saloon doors swung open with a force that made them slam against the walls. Every man in the circle turned toward the sound, and the sight that greeted them drained the amusement from their faces like water from a broken dam. Tobias Aldrich filled the doorway, his massive frame backlit by the morning sun. His silver pocket watch caught the light as he stepped inside, each footfall deliberate and measured. He took in the scene with eyes that had witnessed too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty, and his jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that had once made hardened soldiers follow him into battles they couldn't win. The saloon fell absolutely silent except for the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. He walked directly to where Bethany knelt, his presence parting the circle of men like a ship cutting through calm water. Without a word, he lowered himself to one knee beside her, his massive frame folding with surprising grace. The dirty wooden bowl sat between them like an accusation. Tobias looked up at the assembled men, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that needed no amplification. "That's enough." The two words hung in the stale air like a challenge waiting to be answered. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 12 men stood frozen, their cruel entertainment interrupted by the presence of someone who clearly didn't understand the rules of their game. Dutch was the first to recover his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended. "Mister, this ain't your concern. We're just having a friendly conversation with the lady here." Tobias didn't look up from where he knelt beside Bethany. Instead, he reached out and gently pushed the wooden bowl aside, the scraping sound abnormally loud in the hushed saloon. "Miss," he said to Bethany, his voice carrying the kind of respectful tone she hadn't heard directed at her in more years than she could count. "Would you allow me to help you up?" Bethany stared at this stranger who had materialized from nowhere to kneel beside her in the filth. His weathered hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of honest work, rope burns on his palms, scars on his knuckles that spoke of a life lived fully. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They held no pity, no condescension, only a quiet recognition of her worth that the other men seemed incapable of seeing. She began, then found her voice. "Yes, thank you." He extended his hand and she placed hers in it. His grip was gentle but firm as he helped her to her feet, and she felt a strength there that had nothing to do with physical power. Her hand-carved walking stick, made from mountain oak and seasoned by years of faithful service, had fallen during the commotion. He retrieved it and handed it to her with the same careful respect he might show a lady's parasol. "Now hold on just a minute," Pete said, stepping forward with whiskey courage. "You can't just walk in here and what?" Tobias asked, finally turning to face the group. Standing at his full height, he towered over every man in the saloon. But it wasn't his size that made them step back. It was something in his bearing that suggested he'd faced down worse than a dozen drunk bullies and found them wanting. "This is our town," Tommy said, trying to summon the bravado that had felt so natural moments before. "Our business. Your business," Tobias repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "That what you call this? Business?" He gestured to the overturned bowl, to the circle of sawdust where Bethany had been forced to kneel, to the faces around him that still carried traces of their ugly excitement. "Dutch." recognizing that the situation was slipping away from them, tried to reassert control. "Look, stranger, we don't know you and you don't know us. Best you move along before you get yourself into something you can't handle." Tobias considered this advice with the deliberate attention of a man choosing his words carefully. "Been moving along for more years than I care to count," he said finally. "But sometimes a man has to stop moving and start standing." The confrontation might have escalated then, but the saloon door opened again, admitting Heinrich Müller and his wife Emma. The storekeeper took in the scene, Bethany standing with her walking stick, the giant stranger beside her, the circle of men with guilt written across their faces, and his expression hardened. "Gentlemen," Heinrich said, his German accent thickening with disapproval, "I think you've had enough excitement for one morning." Emma Müller surprised everyone by stepping forward, her earlier coldness toward Bethany replaced by something that might have been shame. "Miss Crenshaw, are you hurt? Do you need anything?" The concern in her voice was genuine, and it seemed to break whatever spell had held the saloon in its grip. The men began to shuffle and mutter, their pack mentality dissolving in the face of community disapproval. "We weren't doing nothing wrong," Tommy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No?" Heinrich asked. "Then you won't mind explaining your actions to Marshal Kearney when he returns from county business." The mention of the marshal sent visible ripples through the group. Whatever they'd convinced themselves about the harmlessness of their entertainment, they clearly didn't want to explain it to law enforcement. Pete made one last attempt to save face. "Come on, boys. Let's let the mountain woman and her champion enjoy each other's company." The sneer in his voice was unmistakable, but he was already backing toward the door. The men filed out one by one, their earlier camaraderie replaced by the sullen resentment of bullies who'd been denied their sport. Dutch was the last to leave, pausing at the threshold to deliver a parting shot. "This ain't over," he said, though whether he was addressing Bethany or Tobias wasn't clear. When the saloon doors finally swung shut, the silence that followed felt different, cleaner somehow, as if something poisonous had been drained from the air. Heinrich approached them, his round face creased with concern. "Miss Crenshaw, I apologize. If I'd known what they were planning—" "You couldn't have known," Bethany said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And you came when it mattered." Emma Müller stepped closer, wringing her hands. "I should have. When I saw them gathering, I should have done something. Should have sent Heinrich right away." The admission cost her something, Bethany could see. Emma had always maintained her distance, always made it clear that mountain folk weren't quite respectable enough for her tastes. But witnessing the morning's events had apparently shifted something in her perspective. "You came," Bethany said simply. "That's what matters." Tobias had been quiet during these exchanges, but now he spoke up. "Ma'am," he said to Bethany, "if you don't mind my asking, where are you staying while you're in town?" "The boarding house," she replied, "though I suspect Mrs. Patterson might not be so welcoming after this morning's events." Heinrich and Emma exchanged a look. "Nonsense," Emma said firmly. "You'll stay with us tonight. I won't have it said that we left you to face this alone." The offer clearly surprised Bethany as much as it did Heinrich. But after 15 years of marriage, he recognized his wife's determination when he saw it. "Of course," he agreed warmly. "We have a spare room, and Emma's cooking is far better than anything you'll find at the boarding house." Tobias cleared his throat. "If I might suggest, perhaps it would be best if someone stayed with Miss Crenshaw while she's in town. Those men don't strike me as the type to let things lie. Are you volunteering, Mr.?" Heinrich asked. "Aldrich. Tobias Aldrich." He touched the brim of his hat. "And yes, sir, I suppose I am. If the lady doesn't object." All eyes turned to Bethany. The morning had stripped away her usual composure, left her feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since her first winter alone on the mountain. The idea of accepting help from a stranger went against every instinct she'd developed. Over 20 years of self-reliance, but the alternative, facing whatever Dutch and his friends might plan next, seemed even more daunting. "I'd be grateful for the company." "Mr. Aldrich," she said formally. Something passed between them then, a understanding that went beyond words. He'd seen her at her most vulnerable and hadn't turned away. She'd accepted his help without losing her dignity. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find in a place like Grizzly Hollow. Outside, the normal sounds of town life were resuming, the stamp mills, the street traffic, the everyday business of survival. But inside the Copper Crown, 4 people stood in the aftermath of something that had changed them all. "Well then," Heinrich said, breaking the spell, "I believe we have some plans to make." The Müller house sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-story structure that spoke of German practicality and quiet prosperity. Emma bustled about, preparing the spare room with an efficiency that suggested she was using activity to work through her own complicated feelings about the morning's events. "I'll need to check on my horse," Bethany said as Emma showed her to the room. "Make sure the blacksmith finished his work." "I'll walk with you," Tobias offered. He'd been invited to take his meals with the Müllers as well. Heinrich's way of ensuring that their unexpected guest felt welcome and protected. Walk to the blacksmith shop took them past the general store, where several townspeople found excuses to step outside and observe the mountain woman and her unlikely champion. Their looks ranged from curious to concerned, but none carried the naked hostility that had characterized the morning's confrontation. At the blacksmith's, they found Bethany's horse properly shod and waiting in the small corral behind the shop. The animal, a sturdy mare named Greta, whickered softly when she saw Bethany approaching. "She's a fine animal," Tobias observed, running his practiced eye over the horse's conformation. "Mountain bred." Her mother was. "I've been breeding for hardiness more than speed." Bethany stroked Greta's neck, taking comfort in the familiar gesture. "She's gotten me through more blizzards than I can count." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both finding peace in the presence of honest animals after the morning's ugliness. Finally Tobias spoke. "Been carrying this around for more years than I'd like to admit," he said, withdrawing something from his vest pocket. It was a small silver-framed photograph, somewhat faded but carefully preserved. The image showed a woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Bethany looked at the photograph, understanding immediately why he'd shown it to her. "Your wife?" "Margaret," he said softly. "They've been gone 8 years now. Viva took her." He studied the image for a moment before returning it to his pocket, close to his heart, where his father's silver watch ticked steadily. "She had your kind of strength. Different circumstances, but the same quality." The comparison meant more to Bethany than she could express. To be likened to someone clearly cherished, someone whose memory still brought tenderness to this giant man's eyes. It was a gift she hadn't expected. "What did she think of your traveling?" Bethany asked. Tobias chuckled, but there was sadness in the sound. "She used to say I was running toward something I'd never find by running away from things I should face." "Smart woman. Probably right, too." They began walking back toward town, their conversation flowing with surprising ease. Bethany found herself sharing details about her mountain life that she'd never told anyone. The peace of watching sunrise paint the peaks, the satisfaction of living by seasons instead of clocks, the unexpected companionship of the wildlife that shared her territory. "Why did you choose that life?" Tobias asked. "Most folks, they want to be around other people." Bethany was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain. "I was married once. Young and foolish and full of dreams about love conquering everything." She paused, watching a hawk circle overhead. "James was charming, handsome, said all the right things. Took me 2 years to realize that his charm was just another kind of trap." Tobias didn't press for details, but Bethany seemed to want to continue. "He had a temper, and fists to go with it. I stayed longer than I should have. Kept thinking I could change him, fix whatever was broken inside him." She touched her left shoulder absently, where an old injury still ached in cold weather. "Finally realized the only thing broken was my judgment. So you left, ran, escaped, call it whatever you want. Took what I could carry and headed for the mountains. Been there ever since." She looked at him directly. People talk about being civilized, but I've seen more genuine kindness from bears than I saw from that man who promised to love and protect me. They'd reached the general store, where Heinrich was helping load supplies into a wagon. He waved when he saw them, and Bethany waved back, a simple gesture that would have been impossible for her yesterday. "That's changing, though," Tobias observed. "The kindness, I mean. You've got friends here now, do I?" Bethany asked, genuine uncertainty in her voice. "Or do I just have people who felt guilty about what they witnessed?" "Heinrich Müller didn't look guilty in that saloon," Tobias said. He looked angry. "There's a difference. And his wife, Emma, is it? She's wrestling with something deeper than guilt." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma emerged from the store and hurried over to them. Her earlier nervousness had been replaced by a determined purposefulness that reminded Bethany of women she'd known who were done apologizing and ready to act. "Miss Crenshaw," Emma said breathlessly, "I've been thinking about what happened this morning, and I want you to know something." She glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "Those men, Pete and Dutch and the others, this wasn't the first time they've done something like this. There was a young woman traveling through last spring with her children. They made her life miserable until she left town in the middle of the night. The revelation didn't entirely surprise Bethany, but it did explain the practiced cruelty she'd witnessed. And before that," Emma continued, "there was an old man, a prospector who'd hit a small strike. They convinced him he owed them drinks for the whole saloon, then kept raising the debt until he'd drunk away everything he'd found." "Why are you telling me this?" Bethany asked. Emma straightened, and for the first time since Bethany had known her, she looked truly formidable. "Because I'm tired of being the kind of person who watches bad things happen and tells herself it's not her business. Because my Heinrich is a good man, and this town is lucky to have him. And I won't see it poisoned by bullies who mistake cruelty for entertainment." She paused, gathering herself before delivering the most important part of her message. "And because I want you to know that if you decide to stay in town longer, or if you just want to visit more often, you'll always have a place at our table and friends to stand with you." The offer was clearly heartfelt, and it touched something in Bethany that she'd thought permanently hardened by years of solitude. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Müller." "Emma," the older woman corrected. "And it's not kindness. It's just what neighbors should do for each other." As they walked back to the house together, Tobias found himself thinking about Margaret's words, about running toward something instead of running away. For the first time in 8 years, he felt like he might have found a place worth stopping for, but he also felt the weight of experience that told him the morning's confrontation was just the beginning. Men like Dutch Vanderberg didn't back down from challenges to their authority, especially when those challenges came from outsiders who made them look weak in front of their peers. The question wasn't whether there would be more trouble. The question was what form it would take, and whether the fragile alliances forming around Bethany Crenshaw would be strong enough to withstand whatever came next. 3 days had passed since the incident at the Copper Crown, and Grizzly Hollow felt like a town holding its breath. Bethany had extended her stay, ostensibly to help Emma Müller with some intricate sewing work that required her mountain-practiced, steady hands. But everyone understood the real reason. She wasn't ready to retreat to her mountain sanctuary, not yet. The change in her reception around town was subtle but unmistakable. Shopkeepers nodded when she passed. Mrs. Patterson had stopped by the Muller house twice, bringing fresh-baked bread and what might have been apologies disguised as small talk. Even the children seemed less inclined to stare and whisper when she walked down Main Street, but Dutch Vanderberg and his circle hadn't disappeared. They'd simply become more calculated in their hostility. It started with her horse. Greta had been staying in the livery stable, and each morning Bethany found small signs of tampering, loosened cinch straps, burrs placed under the saddle blanket, things that could cause injury but might pass for accidents. Zam, the elderly stable hand, claimed he'd seen nothing, but his nervous glances toward the Copper Crown told a different story. Then came the economic pressure. Word spread quietly through certain circles that anyone doing business with the mountain woman might find their own transactions more difficult. Credit suddenly became harder to obtain. Shipments from Denver experienced mysterious delays. Nothing that could be proven, nothing that constituted direct retaliation, but effective nonetheless. Heinrich Müller discovered this firsthand when he tried to place his monthly order for supplies. The Denver wholesaler, who'd done business with him for 15 years, suddenly needed additional documentation and advance payment for goods that had always been delivered on credit. "It's not just affecting me," Heinrich explained to Tobias and Bethany over breakfast. "Anyone who's shown support for Miss Crenshaw is finding their business arrangements more complicated." Emma set down her coffee cup with unusual force. "Cowards! If they have a problem with our choices, they should have the courage to say so directly, instead of skulking around like thieves in the night." Tobias had been quiet through most of the meal, but now he looked up from the town's founding charter he'd been studying, a document Heinrich had retrieved from the store's dusty archives. The yellowed pages told a different story than the current reality of Grizzly Hollow. Says here the town was incorporated with specific provisions about fair treatment and mutual support among residents, he said, his finger tracing the faded text. Something about creating a community where honest folk can prosper regardless of their origins or circumstances. Noble sentiment, Heinrich said with a bitter laugh. Written by men who probably never imagined having to choose between their principles and their profits. "Maybe," Tobias replied. "Or maybe they knew exactly what they were writing and trusted future generations to honor it." That afternoon, while running errands for Emma, Bethany encountered Martha Kellins, a widow who ran a small boarding house for single miners. Martha had always been cordial but distant, acknowledging Bethany's existence without encouraging extended interaction. Today, however, she seemed agitated. "Miss Crenshaw," Martha said, approaching with obvious reluctance, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." They stepped into the narrow alley between Martha's boarding house and the barber shop, away from curious eyes and ears. "I want you to know," Martha began, her voice low and urgent, "that what those men did to you was shameful and wrong, and anyone with half a brain could see it. I appreciate that, Mrs. Kellins, but I also want you to know that they're not done with you." Martha glanced nervously toward the street. "My boarders hear things. Talk in the saloon late at night when the whiskey's flowing freely. They're planning something bigger." Bethany felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly, but Pete Hawkins has been talking about teaching you a lesson you'll never forget. And Dutch," Martha shuddered, "Dutch has been saying things about putting you in your place permanently." The implications hung between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. "Why are you telling me this?" Bethany asked. Martha was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of personal experience. "Because I know what it's like to be alone and vulnerable. When my husband died, there were men in this town who thought I might be available for certain kinds of attention. Men who thought a widow was fair game for whatever they had in mind." She looked directly at Bethany, her eyes fierce with remembered indignation. "The only thing that saved me was having enough money to make myself untouchable. You don't have that protection, but you do have friends now, and that might be enough." As they prepared to part ways, Martha caught Bethany's arm. "Be careful, and tell that big friend of yours to be careful too. They're not just angry at you anymore. They're angry at him for making them look weak, and angry at anyone who's taken your side." That evening, Bethany shared Martha's warning with Tobias and the Muellers. Emma's face went pale, but Heinrich's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we make sure she's not alone," he said firmly. "And we make sure the community understands what's at stake here." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. Heinrich stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "I mean, we stop pretending this is just about Miss Crenshaw. Dutch and his friends are bullies, and bullies don't stop with one victim. They keep pushing until someone pushes back hard enough to make them reconsider." Tobias nodded approvingly. "Your husband's right, Mrs. Muller. This is about more than what happened in the saloon." It's about what kind of community Grizzly Hollow is going to be. Over the next hour, they began planning. Heinrich would quietly reach out to other business owners who might be feeling the economic pressure. Emma would speak to the Women's Church Auxiliary, many of whom had daughters or elderly mothers who could just as easily become targets. Tobias would make himself more visible around town, letting his presence serve as a deterrent to any planned mischief. And Bethany would continue doing what she'd always done, living with dignity, treating others with respect, and refusing to let anyone's cruelty diminish her sense of worth. But as she prepared for bed that night, she found herself checking the locks on the Muller house doors and positioning her walking stick where she could reach it quickly. The mountain had taught her many lessons about survival. But the most important was this: when predators were stalking, a wise person prepared for the hunt to begin. Outside, Dutch van der Berg stood in the shadows across from the Muller house, watching the windows go dark one by one. He wasn't alone. Pete and Tommy flanked him, along with 3 other men whose faces were hidden by the darkness. "Tomorrow night," Dutch said quietly. "When they think they're safe. When they think their little alliance has protected them. What about the big man?" Tommy asked, his voice betraying nervousness. Dutch smiled, but there was nothing pleasant in the expression. "What about him?" "He can't watch her every minute of every day. And when the time comes, he'll learn what happens to outsiders who stick their noses where they don't belong." As the men dispersed into the night, none of them noticed the figure watching from the livery stable's hayloft. Sam, the elderly stable hand, had seen enough of life to recognize when trouble was brewing. And unlike some folks in town, he remembered when Grizzly Hollow had been the kind of place where people looked out for each other instead of preying on the vulnerable. Come morning, he'd have some important information to share with the mountain woman and her friends. Sam's weathered hands shook slightly as he approached the Muller house the next morning, a sure sign that the old stable hand was more nervous than he wanted to admit. Heinrich opened the door at his first soft knock, immediately recognizing the urgency in the elderly man's expression. "Come in, Sam, coffee's fresh." But Sam shook his head, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see watchers in the early morning shadows. "Can't stay long. Just need to tell Miss Crenshaw something important." Within minutes, all 4 of them were gathered in the Muller kitchen, Bethany still tying her hair back, Tobias alert despite the early hour, Emma wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "I seen them last night," Sam said without preamble. Dutch and his boys, standing across the street watching this house. "Heard them talking too." Bethany's hand moved instinctively to her mother's wedding ring, which she wore on a chain beneath her dress. The simple gold band had been her mother's most precious possession, and Bethany had kept it hidden for 20 years, afraid that displaying such a symbol of love and commitment would invite questions about her own failed marriage. "What did they say?" Tobias asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "Dutch wants to grab her tonight when she's walking back from evening church service. Said something about teaching her a lesson she won't forget." Sam's voice dropped to a whisper. "And he said something about you too, Mr. Aldrich, about making sure you understand what happens to folks who interfere in town business." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "We have to tell Marshal Kearney. Marshall's still in Denver on county business," Heinrich reminded her. "Won't be back for 3 days at least. Then we go to the territorial authorities," Emma insisted. Sam shook his head sadly. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Muller, but what would we tell them? That some men stood in the street and had a conversation. They ain't actually done nothing yet. Nothing that can be proved, anyway. The old man was right, and they all knew it. The law dealt with actions, not intentions, and Dutch was too clever to leave evidence of conspiracy lying around. There's another problem," Sam continued reluctantly. "Word's getting around about Miss Crenshaw staying in town so long. Some folks are saying she's stirring up trouble, bringing discord to a peaceful community." "Peaceful," Bethany repeated bitterly. "Is that what they call forcing a woman to eat scraps off a saloon floor?" "You and I know better," Sam said gently. "But not everyone saw what happened that morning. And the folks who did, Well, some of them are starting to forget the details, if you catch my meaning. Tobias understood immediately. Fear and social pressure had a way of reshaping memory, making witnesses forget what they'd seen when remembering became inconvenient or dangerous. We need more allies, he said quietly. People who'll stand with us when the time comes. I might know where to start, Heinrich said slowly. There's a few businessmen who've been feeling the squeeze since all this started. Jacob Steiner, who runs the bakery, Frank Morrison at the feed store, old Doc Patterson. They've all had their credit arrangements suddenly become more complicated. Emma had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with determination. And I know several women who are tired of living in fear. Martha Kellens, obviously, but also Sarah Brennan. She's Tommy's mother, and she's ashamed of what her boy's gotten mixed up in. And Rebecca Walsh, whose husband works the night shift at the stamp mill. She's been worried about walking home alone after dark. Over the next hour, they developed a plan. Heinrich would discreetly approach the affected businessman, framing the conversation not as taking sides, but as protecting their mutual economic interests. Emma would speak to the women, emphasizing that Dutch's behavior threatened all of them, not just Bethany. And Tobias would make himself visible throughout the day, reminding everyone that Bethany wasn't as isolated as her enemies believed, but Bethany herself had been thinking about something else entirely. I want to see this founding charter you mentioned, she said to Heinrich. He looked puzzled, but fetched the yellow document from where he'd left it on the kitchen sideboard. Bethany studied it carefully, her finger tracing the faded text just as Tobias had done the previous day. All residents shall be treated with dignity regardless of their origins or circumstances, she read aloud. Community decisions shall be made through open discussion and mutual respect, not through intimidation or economic coercion. She looked up at the others, and they saw something new in her expression, not just determination, but genuine hope. What if we held them to this? She asked. What if we reminded the whole town what they originally agreed to stand for? How do you mean? Emma asked. A town meeting, Bethany said, her voice growing stronger as the idea took shape. A public forum where anyone can speak their mind about what kind of community Grizzly Hollow should be. Make Dutch and his friends defend their actions in front of the whole town instead of skulking around in shadows. Tobias considered this, recognizing both the brilliance and the danger of the proposal. It would force everything into the open, he said slowly. No more whispered threats or anonymous economic pressure. Everyone would have to choose sides publicly. Exactly, Bethany said. And I hope, that most people in this town are better than Dutch Vanderberg and his friends. They just need to be reminded of it. Heinrich was nodding thoughtfully. The charter does provide for public meetings, and as a town councilman, I have the authority to call one. When? Emma asked. Tomorrow night, Bethany said firmly. Before they have a chance to carry out whatever they're planning. Before anyone else gets hurt or driven away. Sam cleared his throat. Miss Crenshaw, you sure about this? Standing up in front of the whole town, making yourself even more of a target? Bethany touched the chain around her neck, feeling the weight of her mother's ring. Her mother had been a gentlewoman who'd never raised her voice or caused trouble for anyone. But she'd also been strong in ways that didn't require violence or cruelty to prove themselves. I'm sure, Bethany said. I've spent 20 years hiding on that mountain, telling myself I was being independent, when maybe I was just being afraid. Maybe it's time to find out what happens when you stop running and start standing. As Sam prepared to leave, he paused at the door. You know, Miss Crenshaw, there's something else you might want to consider. What's that? The old man smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked hopeful rather than worried. Dutch and his boys ain't the only ones who've been talking in the saloon. There's others too, miners and teamsters and working men who've been watching what's happening and don't much like it. They just haven't had anyone to speak for them yet. As the door closed behind him, the 4 remaining occupants of the Mueller kitchen looked at each other with a mixture of determination and apprehension. They'd committed themselves to a course of action that would force the community to confront its own character, and there was no predicting what they'd discover when that mirror was finally held up for everyone to see. But for the first time since the incident at the Copper Crown, Bethany felt like she was moving towards something instead of running away from it. And judging by the expression on Tobias's face, he was feeling something similar. The question now was whether Grizzly Hollow was ready to live up to the ideals its founders had put down in faded ink on yellowing paper, or whether those words had been nothing more than pretty sentiment from the beginning. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the Mueller house, a well-dressed man in his 50s who introduced himself as Walter Grimsby, representing the Denver Mining Consortium. His arrival coincided with Heinrich's return from posting notices about the evening's town meeting, and the timing felt far from coincidental. "I understand there's been some unrest in your community," Grimsby said, settling into the Mueller's parlor with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "My employers are concerned about maintaining stable business relationships in the region." Tobias studied the man carefully, noting the expensive cut of his clothes, the soft hands that had never seen manual labor, and most importantly, the way his eyes never quite met anyone else's directly. He'd encountered Grimsby's type before, men who wielded power through intermediaries and considered themselves above the messy realities of the lives they controlled. "What kind of business does the Denver Mining Consortium have in Grizzly Hollow?" Bethany asked, her voice carefully neutral. Grimsby smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We hold significant interests in several mining operations here. The Lucky Strike, the Mountain King, the Prosperity Claim. We also have arrangements with various merchants and service providers who support the mining community." Heinrich felt a chill run down his spine. Those were exactly the businesses that had been experiencing mysterious difficulties with their credit and supply arrangements. "And you're concerned about unrest," Emma said. "It wasn't a question." "Precisely, Mrs. Mueller. You see, investors in Denver don't appreciate unpredictability. They prefer communities where everyone understands their place and works together harmoniously." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "Disruptions can be expensive to resolve." Tobias had heard enough. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Grimsby?" The man turned his attention to Tobias with obvious distaste. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the simplest solution to a problem is for the source of that problem to relocate, with appropriate compensation for any inconvenience. Of course." He withdrew a thick envelope from his jacket and placed it on the coffee table between them. "Miss Crenshaw, isn't it? I understand you have a property in the mountains. Remote, isolated, perfect for someone who prefers solitude. The consortium would be happy to purchase it at well above market value, providing you with the means to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere far from Grizzly Hollow." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Heinrich's mantel clock. Everyone understood what was really being offered, and what was being threatened if the offer was refused. Bethany stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. "And if I don't want to sell?" Grimsby's smile became strained. "Well, there are other considerations. Property taxes, for instance. Mining claims can affect water rights. Environmental regulations that might require expensive compliance. Measures." He shrugged as if these were merely unfortunate possibilities rather than thinly veiled threats. "And what about the meeting tonight?" Heinrich asked, his German accent thickening with anger. "I would strongly advise against it," Grimsby said firmly. "Public forums have a way of stirring up emotions, creating divisions that didn't exist before. Much better to handle these matters quietly, between reasonable people." It was then that Tobias remembered something that had been nagging at him since the incident. At the Copper Crown, he'd seen Dutch Vanderberg's type. Before, bullies who thought they were operating independently, but were actually following someone else's script. "Tell me, Mr. Grimsby," Tobias said slowly, "how long has the consortium been concerned about stability in Grizzly Hollow?" "I'm not sure I understand your question." "I think you do." Tobias stood, his considerable height allowing him to loom over the seated man. "Because the kind of unrest you're talking about didn't start with Miss Crenshaw. It's been going on for months, hasn't it? Maybe longer." Grimsby shifted uncomfortably. "There have been various incidents involving people who might interfere with consortium business," Heinrich interrupted, understanding beginning to dawn in his voice. "The traveling woman with children that Emma mentioned, the old prospector who lost his strike to a bar debt. And now Miss Crenshaw," Emma gasped as the pieces fell into place. "You've been paying them, Dutch and his friends, paying them to drive away anyone who might cause problems for your employers. That's a very serious accusation," Grimsby said. But his tone suggested he was more concerned about proof than truth. Bethany felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. "What kind of problems would a mountain woman cause for a mining consortium?" "Your property sits above several promising claims," Grimsby admitted reluctantly, "and your water rights could complicate future extraction operations. But more importantly, you represent a certain independence that can be contagious if left unchecked." The truth hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't about her personality or her unconventional lifestyle, or even about standing up to bullies. This was about business. Cold, calculated business that required the removal of inconvenient obstacles. The founding charter, Heinrich said suddenly. "That's why you're so concerned about tonight's meeting. Because if people actually read it, they'll realize what this town was supposed to stand for." Grimsby's composure finally cracked. "That charter is a piece of historical nostalgia with no legal standing. The real authority in Grizzly Hollow comes from economic relationships, not faded ink on old paper." "Maybe," Tobias said quietly. "But people have a funny way of remembering their principles when reminded of them." The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment they heard the sound of running feet outside. Tommy Brennan burst through the front door without knocking, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Miss Crenshaw, Mr. Aldrich, you need to come quick." He stopped short when he saw Grimsby, confusion replacing urgency. Sorry, I didn't know. What's wrong, Tommy?" Heinrich asked, noting that the young man seemed genuinely distressed rather than threatening. "It's my ma. She sent me to find you. Said to tell you that she heard Dutch and Pete talking at the boarding house, and it ain't just about tonight anymore." He glanced nervously at Grimsby. "Maybe I should come back later." "No," Bethany said firmly. "What did your mother hear?" Tommy looked torn between loyalty to his friends and something that might have been his conscience. Finally, conscience won. They're planning to burn down the church where the meeting's supposed to be held. Tonight, before anyone can gather. And they're saying, he swallowed hard, they're saying they got orders from someone important. Someone with enough money to make sure nobody asks too many questions afterward. All eyes turned to Grimsby, who had gone pale beneath his expensive cologne and carefully groomed whiskers. "I think," Tobias said with deadly calm, "that Mr. Grimsby was just leaving." The man gathered his dignity along with his hat and envelope. "This conversation isn't over. The consortium has significant resources and long reach. I suggest you all consider that carefully." After he left, the room erupted in overlapping conversations. Emma worried about the safety of holding the meeting. Heinrich talked about sending word to the territorial authorities. Tommy apologized repeatedly for his friend's planned actions, while insisting he'd had no part in planning them. But Bethany was quiet, processing the revelation that changed everything she'd thought she understood about her situation. The cruelty she'd endured wasn't personal, it was professional. Dutch and his friends hadn't targeted her because they disliked mountain women or outsiders. They targeted her because someone was paying them to drive her away. The realization should have made her feel better, knowing the attacks weren't really about her character or worth as a person. Instead, it made her angrier than she'd ever been in her life. "We're still holding the meeting," she said, her voice cutting through the other conversations like a blade. "Bethany," Emma protested, "if they're planning to burn down the church, then we'll hold it somewhere else." Bethany stood, and everyone could see the steel in her spine. "They want to operate in shadows and secrecy. Then we'll drag everything into the light. Every dirty deal, every threat, every act of intimidation they've committed in the name of business interests. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. But I won't ask anyone else to take risks for my problems. This is my fight now. No, Heinrich said firmly. This is our fight, all of us. Because if they can do this to you, they can do it to anyone who gets in their way. Tommy stepped forward, his young face set with determination. Count me in too, and my ma, and I know others who'll stand with us if they understand what's really happening. As evening approached and word spread through town about the change in plans, Bethany found herself thinking about the founding charter and the men who'd written it. They'd envisioned a community where honest folks could prosper, regardless of their origins or circumstances. Tomorrow night, Grizzly Hollow would find out whether that vision was worth fighting for. Word of the evening's revelations spread through Grizzly Hollow like wildfire through dry timber. By sunset, the town had divided itself into 3 distinct camps: those who supported Bethany and the ideals of the founding charter, those who remained loyal to Dutch and the established order, and a significant number who simply wanted to avoid choosing sides altogether. The church having been deemed unsafe due to the arson threat, Heinrich had made arrangements to hold the meeting in the town's original structure, a large log building that had served as both courthouse and community center during Grizzly Hollow's early days. The building sat on the outskirts of town, close enough to be accessible, but far enough from the main business district to avoid easy sabotage. As evening approached, Bethany found herself standing before the cracked mirror in the Mueller's guest room, preparing for what might be the most important conversation of her life. She'd chosen her best dress, still simple and practical, but clean and mended with care. Her mother's wedding ring hung around her neck, visible now for the first time in 20 years. Catching the lamplight like a small beacon of hope, Emma knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of a woman who'd spent the afternoon wrestling with difficult decisions. "I've been thinking about what you said," Emma began, settling into the room's single chair. "About this being your fight." "Emma, let me finish." The older woman's voice carried a firmness that brooked no argument. "You're wrong. This isn't just about you or your property or even what those men did in the saloon. It's about what kind of people we are when we think nobody's watching." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've lived in this town for 15 years. Watched it change from a place where neighbors helped each other to a place where people look the other way when bad things happen. I told myself it wasn't my business, that Heinrich and I should focus on our own affairs and let others handle theirs." Emma's voice grew quiet, almost confessional. "But watching you kneel on that saloon floor while grown men laughed, that changed something in me. Made me realize that when good people do nothing, evil people think they have permission." Bethany felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't owe me anything, Emma. You and Heinrich have already done more than I had any right to expect." "We don't owe you," Emma agreed, "but we owe ourselves, and we owe this community the chance to remember what it was supposed to be." Downstairs, Heinrich was conducting his own form of preparation, cleaning and loading the rifle he hadn't touched since the Indian Wars of his youth. Not because he expected to need it, this was Grizzly Hollow, not Dodge City, but because the weight of the weapon reminded him that some things were worth defending with more than words. Tobias found him in the kitchen, methodically checking each cartridge before sliding it into the magazine, expecting trouble. Tobias asked, hoping to prevent it, Heinrich replied. "Dutch van der Berg strikes me as the type who might try to disrupt things if he thinks he can get away with it." Tobias nodded, understanding the logic. He'd made his own preparations, writing a detailed letter to the territorial authorities about everything they'd discovered, including Grimsby's visit and the consortium's apparent involvement. If tonight went badly, at least there would be a record of what had happened and why. "Heinrich," he said quietly, "there's something you should know about my past." The storekeeper looked up from his rifle, noting the serious tone. "I wasn't always just a drifting cowboy," Tobias continued. "During the war, I served with a cavalry unit. Later, I spent some time as a territorial marshal. Before before Margaret died and I started running from everything that reminded me of the life we'd planned together. He withdrew a folded paper from his vest pocket, old and creased but still official looking. This badge hasn't been active in 8 years, but the authority it represents doesn't expire. If Dutch and his friends try to disrupt tonight's meeting with violence, I have the legal right to stop them. Heinrich studied the badge, then looked up at Tobias with new respect. Does Bethany know? Not yet. I'll tell her after tonight, assuming we all survive what's coming. Outside, the first attendees were making their way toward the old log building, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the gathering darkness. Jacob Steiner, the baker whose credit had been mysteriously cancelled, walked alongside Frank Morrison from the feed store. Both men carried the grim determination of business owners who'd finally decided to fight back against economic intimidation. Sarah Brennan arrived with Martha Kellins and Rebecca Walsh, 3 women who'd spent too many years afraid to walk alone after dark. They'd found strength in numbers and a shared resolve to reclaim their community from the bullies who'd held it hostage. Even more encouraging was the sight of miners and mill workers arriving in small groups, men who worked hard for low wages and had little patience for the political games of their supposed betters. Among them was Big Jim Patterson, a shift foreman at the stamp mill who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. But Dutch's supporters were gathering too. Pete Hawkins had positioned himself near the building's entrance with several of his cronies, ostensibly just arriving early, but actually serving as scouts to report on attendance and mood. Their presence was meant to be intimidating, and for some attendees, it worked. Bethany watched several people approach the building, see Pete's group, and quietly turn away. As the appointed hour approached, Bethany stood with Tobias and the Mullers at the edge of the crowd, feeling the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She'd spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of public attention, and now she was about to voluntarily walk into the center of it. "You don't have to do this," Tobias said quietly, sensing her nervousness. "Yes, I do," she replied, touching the chain around her neck. "I owe it to my mother, who taught me that dignity is something you carry inside yourself. I owe it to everyone who's been too afraid to speak up. And I owe it to the woman I was before James convinced me I was worth less than the dirt on his boots." The crowd was larger than any of them had expected. Nearly 50 people in a town that counted barely 300 souls. Some faces were friendly, others curious, and a few openly hostile. But they were all there, and that was what mattered. Heinrich called the meeting to order, reading from the founding charter in his clear, steady voice. The words seemed to carry extra weight in the lamplight, reminding everyone present of promises made by better men in more hopeful times. When he finished reading, a murmur ran through the crowd. Some people were hearing those words for the first time in years, if ever. Others were remembering why their parents or grandparents had chosen to build their lives in Grizzly Hollow rather than some other mining town. "The purpose of tonight's meeting," Heinrich continued, "is to discuss what these principles mean for our community today, to decide whether we're living up to the ideals our founders established or whether we've lost our way." He paused, looking around the room until his eyes found Bethany. "Miss Crenshaw has asked to address the community about recent events and their broader implications. But before she speaks, I want everyone here to understand something. We're not here to relitigate past grievances or assign blame. We're here to decide what kind of town Grizzly Hollow is going to be moving forward." Dutch van der Berg stood up from his seat near the back of the room, his voice carrying easily in the log building's acoustics. "With respect, Muller, some of us weren't consulted about this meeting or its purpose. Seems like you're trying to railroad the community into accepting your particular version of events." A ripple of agreement came from Dutch's supporters, but it was answered by voices from the other side of the room, insisting that everyone had been invited and everyone was welcome to speak. Heinrich raised his hand for quiet. "Mr. van der Berg, you're absolutely right that you weren't consulted about calling this meeting. That's because the charter gives any 3 residents the right to call a public forum, and we had considerably more than 3 signatures on our request. He gestured to the crowd. But you're here now, and you'll have every opportunity to present your perspective. Dutch's jaw tightened, but he sat back down. Clearly, he'd hoped to derail the meeting before it could gain momentum. Bethany rose from her seat, feeling every eye in the room focus on her. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "My name is Bethany Crenshaw. Most of you know me as the mountain woman who comes to town to trade. What you might not know is that 4 days ago I was forced to kneel on the floor of the Copper Crown Saloon. And that's enough," Dutch interrupted, standing again. "We don't need to rehash old business that's been blown out of proportion." But Tobias was also standing now, his massive frame commanding immediate attention. "The lady has the floor, Mr. Vanderberg. She has the right to finish her statement." The 2 men stared at each other across the crowded room, and everyone present could feel the tension building towards something that might explode beyond words and into violence. It was then that the building's front door opened, and Walter Grimsby walked in as if he owned the place, followed by 2 men who were clearly not miners or merchants. Their city clothes and watchful eyes marked them as the kind of men who solved problems that couldn't be handled through normal business channels. The room fell completely silent as Grimsby surveyed the gathering. With obvious disdain, "I'm disappointed," he said, his voice carrying easily in the hushed space. "I'd hoped that cooler heads would prevail and this unnecessary drama could be avoided. But since you've chosen to ignore reasonable advice, perhaps it's time for a more direct conversation about Grizzly Hollow's future." The battle lines were finally drawn, and everyone in the room understood that whatever happened next would determine not just Bethany's fate, but the soul of their entire community. The ornate mirror behind the makeshift speaker's platform had been salvaged from the old courthouse and positioned to reflect lamplight around the room, but now it seemed to cast truth back at every face present. In its surface, Bethany could see the entire gathering, supporters and opponents, the curious and the committed, all waiting to discover what kind of community they really belonged to. Grimsby's entrance had shifted the entire dynamic of the meeting. What had begun as a local discussion about community values had suddenly become something larger and more dangerous, a confrontation between the people of Grizzly Hollow and the outside interests that sought to control them. "Mr. Grimsby," Heinrich said, his voice carefully controlled, "this is a closed community meeting for residents only. I represent significant business interests in this community," Grimsby replied smoothly. "Interests that employ most of the people in this room. I think that gives me standing to participate in discussions that might affect those interests." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded agreement. Jobs were hard to come by in mining country, and antagonizing employers was a dangerous game. But others bristled at the implicit threat in Grimsby's words. Bethany realized that this was her moment. If she waited for permission for the perfect time, for someone else to speak first, the initiative would slip away and never return. "Mr. Grimsby is right about one thing," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Jobs are important. Livelihoods matter. But what happens when keeping your job requires you to forget who you are?" She stepped forward, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. The lamplight caught her mother's wedding ring, making it gleam like a small star against her dark dress. 4 days ago, I was humiliated in the Copper Crown Saloon, made to kneel on the floor and eat scraps like an animal while grown men laughed. Her voice remained steady, but the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. "I thought it was personal. I thought it was because some people don't like mountain folk, or because I don't fit their idea of what a proper woman should be." Dutch started to object, but Bethany continued without pause. "But this afternoon, Mr. Grimsby offered to buy my property for well above market value if I'd just disappear. And when I asked why a mining consortium cared about one woman's mountain cabin, he told me the truth." She turned to face Grimsby directly. "Tell them what you told me about independence being contagious." Grimsby's composure cracked slightly. That conversation was taken out of context. Was it? Bethany challenged. Then explain the context to everyone here. Explain why the Denver Mining Consortium has been paying local men to drive away anyone who might interfere with their business plans. The accusation hit the room like a thunderclap. Voices erupted from all sides, denials from Dutch and his supporters, demands for proof from others, expressions of shock from those hearing this for the first time. But it was Tommy Brennan who provided the corroboration that silenced the chaos. The young man stood up slowly, his face pale but resolute. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone present. "Dutch has been getting money from Denver. He told us it was just to keep troublemakers in line, keep the town peaceful for business. Said it was patriotic, helping the economy grow." His mother, Sarah, gasped from across the room. "Tommy, what have you done?" "I'm sorry, Ma," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry for all of it. But I can't keep lying about what we did to Miss Crenshaw, or to that traveling woman last spring, or to old man Henderson when he struck silver on his claim." Dutch was on his feet now, his face flushed with anger. "You little fool, you don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Tommy shot back, finding courage he'd never known he possessed. "I know about the money Grimsby's been sending, and I know about the list of people he wanted run out of town, and I know you told us we were doing important work for important people." He pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket and held it up. "This is the list, with Miss Crenshaw's name at the top. Want me to read the rest of the names? Want everyone to hear who else the consortium wants gone?" Grimsby's two companions had moved closer during this exchange, their intent clear to anyone who'd spent time in rough company. But Tobias was watching them carefully, his hand resting near the hidden badge in his vest pocket. The crowd was buzzing now, voices overlapping as neighbors turned to neighbors, processing the revelation that their community had been manipulated by outside interests for months or possibly years. It was Big Jim Patterson, the stamp mill foreman, who asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Dutch, is it true? Have you been taking money to run people out of town?" Dutch looked around the room, seeing doubt and suspicion where he'd once commanded respect. His carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time, and the desperate anger in his eyes suggested he was about to do something that would make the situation much worse. "You people don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "You think this is about one mountain woman and her hurt feelings? This is about progress. This is about bringing prosperity to Grizzly Hollow, instead of letting it die a slow death like every other played-out mining town in the territory." He gestured wildly at the crowd. "You want to live in the past, following some dusty old charter written by men who never had to compete with modern business? Fine, but don't expect the rest of us to go down with you." That was when Grimsby made his fatal mistake. Seeing Dutch's position deteriorating, he decided to reveal the full extent of the consortium's power. "Perhaps it's time everyone understood the reality of the situation," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of money and influence. "The Denver Mining Consortium doesn't just employ half this town, we own it. The mineral rights, the water rights, the railroad spur that brings in your supplies. We can make Grizzly Hollow prosperous, or we can let it wither and die." The threat was unmistakable, and it hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. But instead of cowing the crowd, it seemed to crystallize their resolve. These were people who'd come west to build something better than what they'd left behind. They hadn't traveled hundreds of miles and endured countless hardships just to become pawns in someone else's game. Bethany stepped closer to the center of the room, where her trading scales sat on a small table. Heinrich had brought them as a symbol of honest dealing and fair judgment. The scales caught the lamplight, their brass pans gleaming like golden bowls of justice, waiting to weigh the community's choices. "You want to talk about prosperity, Mr. Grimsby?" she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "Then let's weigh what you're offering against what you're asking us to give up." She gestured to the scales. "On one side you promise jobs and money from Denver. On the other side, she paused, looking around the room at faces she was beginning to recognize as neighbors rather than strangers. On the other side, you're asking us to give up our right to decide who belongs here and who doesn't. Our right to stand up for each other when times get hard. Our right to be the kind of people we can look at in the mirror without shame. Big Jim Patterson stood up, his massive frame commanding immediate attention. Miss Crenshaw's right. I've worked for the consortium for 8 years, and I can tell you that their idea of prosperity is different from ours. They want us productive and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps they throw our way. He looked directly at Dutch. And they don't much care how that gets accomplished, do they, Vanderberg? Dutch's face had gone from flushed to pale, but his jaw was set with stubborn defiance. You think you're so righteous, Patterson? You think this town can survive without consortium money? Without their contracts and their railroad connections? Maybe, Big Jim replied calmly. But I'd rather find out than live on my knees. That was when one of Grimsby's companions made his move. The man stepped forward aggressively, his hand moving to his jacket in a way that suggested he was accustomed to ending arguments through intimidation. But Tobias was ready. The old marshal's instincts, dormant for 8 years, snapped back to full alertness. In one smooth motion, he revealed his badge and positioned himself between the man and the crowd. Territorial Marshal, he announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Nobody reaches for weapons in my presence unless they want to discuss it with a judge. The room erupted in surprised voices. Emma gasped. Heinrich smiled grimly. Even Dutch looked stunned by this revelation. Grimsby's man stopped mid-reach, clearly reassessing his options now that law enforcement was in the room. Marshal Aldrich, Grimsby said, trying to regain control of the situation. I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding without involving territorial authorities. Oh, but we are involving them, Tobias replied, because conspiracy to intimidate residents, bribery of local officials, and attempted economic coercion are all territorial crimes. And I've got witnesses to all three. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on Tommy Brennan. Son, you did the right thing speaking up. But I need you to do one more thing. I need you to give me that list. And I need you to tell me everything you know about the consortium's payments to Dutch and his friends. Tommy looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly despite her obvious distress. He walked forward and handed the crumpled paper to Tobias. There's more, Tommy said quietly. Papers in Dutch's room at the boarding house. Letters from Grimsby with instructions and money orders from Denver banks. Dutch finally exploded. You little bastard! I trusted you. I brought you in, taught you how the world really works, and this is how you repay me. You taught me how to be cruel. Tommy shot back, tears streaming down his face, but his voice steady. You taught me to enjoy hurting people who couldn't fight back. You taught me that money was more important than decency. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. But my ma taught me something different. She taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by how much he can take from others, but by how much he's willing to give. The room had gone completely quiet, except for the sound of Tommy's voice and the distant stamp of the mills. I want to give something back, he continued. I want to give Miss Crenshaw her dignity back, even though I can't undo what we did to her. I want to give this town back its soul, even if it costs me my friends. He looked directly at Dutch. And I want to give you the chance to remember who you used to be before the money changed you. Dutch stared at him for a long moment, and for just an instant something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of the boy's courage. But then the moment passed, and his face hardened again. Fine, he said. You want to destroy everything we've built here, go ahead. But don't come crying to me when this town dies, and there's nothing left but memories and empty buildings. He turned to leave, but Tobias's voice stopped him. Dutch Vanderberg, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and intimidation of citizens. You have the right to remain silent, but I'd recommend you start talking about who gave you orders and how much they paid you for them. As Tobias moved to take Dutch into custody, Bethany found herself looking around the room at faces that had changed over the course of the evening. Where she'd seen suspicion and hostility just hours before, she now saw something different. Not universal acceptance, perhaps, but at least the possibility of it. The scales on the table seemed to settle into perfect balance, as if the community had finally found its equilibrium between fear and courage, between profit and principles, and for the first time in 20 years, Bethany Crenshaw felt like she truly belonged somewhere. 3 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the peaks surrounding Grizzly Hollow, and Bethany Crenshaw stood on the porch of her mountain cabin, looking down at a town that had become something neither she nor anyone else had expected. The changes hadn't happened overnight. Dutch van der Berg and 2 of his closest associates were serving sentences in the territorial prison in Denver. Walter Grimsby had disappeared back to whatever corporate boardroom had spawned him, though not before the territorial authorities had extracted considerable information about the consortium's activities throughout the region. Tommy Brennan had spent the summer making amends, working extra shifts to help businesses recover from the economic pressure campaign, publicly apologizing to everyone who'd been targeted, and slowly rebuilding his reputation through consistent, decent behavior. But the most significant change was visible from Bethany's porch, a new wooden sign, freshly painted and carefully lettered, that read Crenshaw and Aldrich Trading Post. The sign marked not just a business partnership, but a symbol of how far both of them had traveled from the isolated lives they'd once led. Tobias emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who'd finally found the place he'd been searching for without knowing it. His marshal's badge was displayed openly now. He'd accepted a permanent appointment as the territorial representative for the district, a position that kept him close to Grizzly Hollow while giving him the authority to prevent other communities from falling victim to similar schemes. Emma sent word that the church social is next Sunday, he said, handing her one of the cups. She's hoping you'll bring some of those pine needle cookies. Bethany smiled, still adjusting to the novelty of having social obligations and people who looked forward to her company. I suppose I could manage that. The relationship between them had developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared experiences rather than romantic notions. They were both people who'd been shaped by loss and solitude, and they understood the value of what they'd found together. Not just love, but partnership in its truest sense. Any word from the surveyors? Bethany asked, referring to the territorial team that was mapping mineral and water rights throughout the region. They confirmed what we suspected, Tobias replied. The consortium's claims were based on fraudulent documentation. The original homestead rights are valid, which means you own not just the surface land, but everything under it. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The consortium's attempt to drive her away had actually led to the discovery that she owned valuable mining rights they'd been trying to steal through legal manipulation. Heinrich thinks we should consider selective mining partnerships, Bethany said. Work with honest operators who'll respect the land and the water. What do you think? Bethany was quiet for a moment, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. I think 20 years ago I came to this mountain to hide from the world. But maybe the world followed me up here for a reason. Down in Grizzly Hollow, the morning was bringing its usual bustle of activity, but the quality of that activity had changed. Where once the town had felt tense and divided, it now carried the energy of a community that had rediscovered its sense of purpose. The Copper Crown Saloon had been sold to Big Jim Patterson, who transformed it from a den of casual cruelty into a genuine gathering place where working men could relax without fear of being drawn into someone else's schemes. The old sign advertising entertainment had been replaced with one that simply read, "Good conversation and fair dealing." Heinrich Müller had been elected mayor by an overwhelming margin, running on a platform of transparent government and community self-determination. His first official act had been to have the founding charter reprinted and distributed to every household in town, a along with a letter explaining how close they'd come to losing everything their predecessors had worked to. Bill. Emma Miller had organized the women of Grizzly Hollow into something that went far beyond a church auxiliary. They'd become the town's conscience, speaking up quickly and clearly whenever they saw signs of the old patterns returning. Martha Kellins had emerged as a natural leader, her experience with vulnerability making her sensitive to others who might need protection. "There's something else," Tobias said, withdrawing a letter from his vest pocket. "Came in yesterday's mail." Bethany recognized the official territorial seal and felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Official letters had rarely brought good news in her experience, but as she read, her expression changed from concern to amazement. The territorial governor, having heard about the events in Grizzly Hollow, was recommending their community as a model for other towns facing similar pressures from outside interests. More importantly, he was proposing legislation that would strengthen local authority and make it harder for corporations to manipulate isolated communities. "They want us to testify before the territorial legislature," Bethany said, looking up from the letter. "Us? You and me. About what happened here and how we stopped it." She folded the letter carefully. "They think our story might help other places. The idea of traveling to the territorial capital, of speaking before lawmakers and newspaper reporters, would have terrified the woman who'd knelt on the Copper Crown's floor just 3 months ago. But Bethany Crenshaw had discovered something about herself during those difficult weeks. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, and she had something worth saying. "What do you think?" Tobias asked. Bethany looked out over the valley one more time, taking in the sight of a community that had chosen to remember its better angels. In the distance, she could see children playing in the schoolyard, women hanging laundry while chatting over fence posts, men heading to honest work with dignity intact. "I think," she said slowly, "that some stories are too important to keep to ourselves." As if summoned by her words, a rider appeared on the trail leading up to the cabin. It was Tommy Brennan, who'd taken a job helping to maintain the mountain roads and had become a regular visitor, seeking advice and offering assistance with equal frequency. "Miss Crenshaw, Marshal Aldrich," he called out as he approached. "You'll never guess what just happened in town." They waited while he dismounted, his excitement obvious even from a distance. "A delegation just arrived from Pine Creek," he said breathlessly. "They heard about what we did here, and they want to know how we stood up to the consortium. Seems they're having similar troubles with outside interests trying to control their community." Bethany and Tobias exchanged a look that needed no words. Their story was already spreading, carrying with it the possibility that other communities might find the courage to reclaim their own destinies. As the three of them headed down the mountain toward town, Bethany felt a profound sense of completion. She'd spent 20 years learning to be self-sufficient on this mountain. Now she was learning something even more valuable, how to be part of something larger than herself without losing the independence that defined her. Behind them, the new sign, Crenshaw and Aldrich Trading Post, caught the morning light, a symbol of partnership, belonging, and the simple truth that sometimes the strongest people are those who've learned they don't have to stand alone.